right, well, I'd like to welcome everybody for coming out this afternoon. Before we get into maybe some of the conversations that Bob and I are going to be having, I wanted to get a chance to, introduce the book a little bit. That's what, ultimately we're here to talk about today. And as Mark mentioned with the review, this book is really about an idea. It's about a vision. How does an artistic vision come into being? How does sort of an ethos here? How does a musician start to craft what they want to do with their lives, what kind of music they want to play? This is about Duane Allman crafting his own musical idea, his own identity, and then the process of making that a reality. What that entails is, how do you convince yourself? How do you convince 5 other musicians? How do you start to convince people in the industry? How do you convince, how do you get Phil Walden and Jerry Wexler involved in this? How do you start to get people in a record store to start buying into this vision? How do you get people in a concert hall to start saying, this is what I want to hear. This is what I'm going to tell my friends about. And this is something that there's a little bit of a kind of irony here, a tragic element to this story, in which this is also about a moment in time. This album, the recording of this album, the release of this album, it becoming part of this, pop culture landscape. This is the culmination of that idea. This is that idea becoming a reality, and it's also right at the tail end of Duane's life. So there's also something to be said in this book about how does Duane's identity, how does his idea become the band's identity? How does it become the band's, outlook on the universe? And in a weird way, Duane sort of preps the band to go on without him. He preps the band to survive without, Barry Oakley and without any number of other members who lose their lives along the way. So it's a fascinating book. I say that with some bias. I'm an Allman Brothers Band fan. I'm also an historian, so I enjoy reading other historians. But I think there's something universal about this book. If you're interested in the creative process, whether you're into, movies or books or video games or music or anything like that, this really does get into how does an artist come into their own? How do they start to say, I want to go do something new, something different, something unique? It's a long-winded way to open this thing up. How close am I?
No, you're absolutely spot on, and I'll say, we're both historians. We've gone through this whole process. The end of the history degree, if you don't know this, is a PhD dissertation at the doctorate level. You write a big giant tome, and that from that eventually evolves a book. And so for me, when I finished with my dissertation, turned it in, and then you sit and you go through one final gauntlet where your dissertation committee and anybody else who wants to be there can ask you questions about your research and what you did. And it can be a little bit, anybody who's lived through it knows what that process is like. And I remember finishing, and, I guess they don't get you to that room if they're going to not pass you, but I remember one of my advisors said, make it more about Duane. So my original dissertation, which is just a lot of information that I had gathered somewhat collated into some order. I was actually really proud of it. I thought it was ready. But the idea being, I think I had sort of glossed out some of that about, I will say that at its core, yes, this is about the creative process. This is about an artist who struggles to find his way in the environment where he is. And you mentioned finding bandmates, finding an audience, finding record company support. He had to find, I think, a crucial thing, and it's what he discovered here in Alabama, Northwest Alabama, which is the South was where he made his best music, and he wanted to stay in the South, or needed to, which was completely uncommon. It culminates in an album that I genuinely had a hard time accepting a record. One artistic achievement could define this band, because to me, the Allman Brothers as a musical entity had so many different elements. And you're a fan, and we've talked a little bit about this offline. They had a 43-year career after Duane Allman died. They rose to two different peaks. Up to Duane, then a second one after he died with the Brothers and Sisters album and everything else, crashed, broke up, rose to another peak in 1979, 80, crashed, broke up, and did it again in 89 and stayed together for 25 years at the end. It's a remarkable story because, like you just said, the founding vision, the founding ideal of what Duane Allman wanted to do with music, improvisation, working with virtuosos in front of an audience, everything being the one time you present it. There's no copying, there's no rote, anything. That band carried that through for the entire existence. And like you said, prepping them for him not being there is an excellent way to say that, because that's what they said when he died.
Well, and I don't want to be, overly controversial. We're 5 minutes into this. I don't want to be stepping on landmines. You look at some of their contemporaries, and this is a topic I've got time for us to return to it at a later point in here. But a band like Lynyrd Skynyrd doesn't really survive the plane crash in the swamp. It's difficult to really put them in the same context where this band's height and a commercial level is post Duane. That's really when they become this thing without the guy who made them what it is. And it's just one of these sort of interesting things where Duane has been given this post life in the band that he created. So, again, 43 extra years, but his idea is there. It's still as real as anything. I mean, he's not on the stage, obviously. But it's fascinating.
But he is. And they will say that from a cosmic spiritual way, but also in terms of how that music sounds. Yeah, very much mentions
that repeatedly. Yes. There's a space for him here on the stage every night. But there's so much, tragedy is such a part of just, the rock and roll story when you tell it. If you're getting into individuals like Jimi Hendrix or others who pass away at a young age, they become these kind of mythic figures. But, the Jimi Hendrix experience doesn't survive for another 40 years post. And it's kind of hard to wrap my head around the fact that it was able to achieve some of those heights. I mean, I was fortunate enough to see him over those last 14 years a number of different times, sounding just about as good as they ever had in a decades on from his death. So it's just one of those kind of interesting things where death is such a part of kind of the rock and roll story. I don't know if anyone survives this sort of impact, survives in this sort of way. And your book does get into some of the reasons for that. I think some of the DNA is kind of baked in here with so many of those early struggles that Duane has in his career. I mean, he's forced to deal with setback and failure and striking out and, near misses of, well, I thought this would have been the band, or I thought this could have been the deal. I think that kind of informs him. We're getting a little bit ahead of where we want to do. I want us to start off here.
Good. This is good info, though. And, just to say, everybody, this was the At Fillmore East was their third album. It is, and I'll parse this a bit today, and I continue to parse this. A lot of people are like, oh, greatest live album, greatest live concert, blah, blah, blah. 4 concerts make up this record. This is a curated document. This is not a live album in that sense of we turned the microphones on and then we just released it. They picked the songs carefully. There's a patch. They patched 2 different versions of You Don't Love Me. They cut some stuff, but all in all, it's actually an album recorded live in front of an audience. It's the exact same as Kind of Blue, honestly, except there was no audience in the room when Kind of Blue was recorded. But that's what it is. And it's a remarkable story. Had this record not been successful, my guess is that 43-year career would be an afterthought. And I do say that early on. I think Duane would have been, look at all this great stuff he did, but it never really stopped. There's no greater way in rock and roll to die than in a motorcycle accident, right? I mean, that's just a terrible thing to say, right?
Look, this is going to be a morbid thought. I apologize in advance, but we never had to hear Duane with a synthesizer. We never had to hear Jimi Hendrix with a drum machine. There's something about being kind of
frozen in time.
And we will always remember the young, vibrant Duane Allman. Yep. I would have much rather had some bad albums that he produced in the 50s and 60s. I mean, I hate to speak on it in those terms. But I was struck by, early in the introduction to this book, and I'm sure it would come up early in any sort of conversation you had with anybody about this, that you are playing 2 roles here. And there's some fascinating ways I think that actually speaks to what the Allman Brothers Band is doing once they're up and running, just in terms of being able to occupy a number of different sort of positions in a way that leads to a unique worldview here, a unique outlook. You are a fan and a historian. That is an interesting space to
we're not
occupy.
supposed to show any favor.
Absolutely.
Of any sort, and that we pretend we're objective. I mean, we are as objective as we can be. I'd like to say, we do our best to train ourselves out of it and other people, but we always carry our biases with us. Of course, that's there. Carrying that, I went into my dissertation going, I just want to write. Well, the whole research was I just want to write that the Allman Brothers were the greatest ever, and here's how I know that. Because Mark Wilson said it, and Ed Langen said it, and Tom Ritchie said it, and I was stringing all these quotes together. And a friend who was a historian was like, that's not what those quotes are doing. Now, here I was literally done with a dissertation, and a friend who isn't even in the academy anymore told me, like, no, this is what, and it was eye-opening to me because I love this band. I actually had to stop loving them so much to push through and be able to write something that I felt was that's like good. But I start off by saying, I can't remember what the first line is. You need to know one thing. I am not unbiased when it comes to the Allman Brothers Band. Like, I want you to know that up front. So yeah, I mean, we are taught not to have a lot of that in and almost to be emotionless as we approach things. I'm not emotionless when I approach the civil rights movement. Why am I emotionless when I approach the
I would like
band?
to commend you on that. I think I don't want to have any tomatoes thrown at me from any historians in the crowd. Objectivity is overrated a little bit. That's not entirely true.
Pretending, but the pretense.
We have this kind of impulse to sort of stamp down our passions as we're academics. We're supposed to be above that. Well, why'd you write the book? Why'd you write any book?
Yeah,
why would you pick any topic to
book?
talk about?
Yeah.
So I certainly don't think that this is a screed. I don't think this is a fan writing down in their notes, hey, I really like them. But you can feel that energy in there. I mean, that's what makes a book like this sing, is saying, okay, obviously this guy loves them and he's doing good history, and it didn't take much to convince me I liked them before I read the book. But I think if anybody picks up the book, if you're passionate about anything, it's fun to read that. It's fun to read somebody talk about something they're into, and it doesn't even have to be something I'm into. If I read someone, writing about their love of Beanie Babies, I could probably at least say, well, I can respect that they're into something. I'm into things. We've all got our things that we're into. As far as you being a fan, I was curious, do you have any sort of formative moments here? Are there any early memories you have of that's the moment? A band like the Grateful Dead, which are contemporaries, people that are sometimes tossed into the same.
A lot, yeah.
Their phrase would be, I got on the bus. That would be the way they frame it. At what point did you say, this is my band? At what point did you say, okay, I like this?
Yeah, I literally got on the bus. Yes. So, the quick story is it's all started with a greatest hits CD collection. If anybody ever used to do BMG or Columbia House, bunch of for a penny, the CDs. And in college, I learned a trick where I could sign up my roommates and get extra for me and for my roommate and blah blah blah. So I did that with the Allman Brothers, and that's the first part. I got that CD sometime in 1993, and it was it's like a blue jean jacket cover. It was put together for the CD era of a band that never had really a hit. There's only one hit I think on there, one top 40 hit on that whole record. But they were their best songs, if you will, or the most indicative. And so, I was listening to them. I played guitar. I had been listening to the blues since I started guitar. I was a rock and roller. It was the middle of the era of, frankly, the band I was really into at the time was the Smashing Pumpkins. Turns out they were huge fans of the Allman Brothers. And as soon as I heard that, it opened up my listening to them and to I heard the Allman Brothers in what they did. So fast forward a bit. I met my wife in October of 1993. This will all tie together. The night I met her, we discussed going to see the Smashing Pumpkins in about a month. And we fell in love over that, right? The night before that concert was the first time I saw the Allman Brothers. And I drove down from Orlando to West Palm Beach, Florida in this, the fairgrounds, this big arena, but with no seats, right? Terrible sound bouncing around. And Tom, I'm telling you, man, I walked in expecting that Leonard Skinner tribute show or the Marshall Tucker Band. You know what they do. I was just like, oh my God, they're still doing it? This sounds, and this was a lineup with Warren Haynes and Alan Woody that got back together with the four originals in 1989. So I saw, ironically, Dickie Betts, who had just gotten out of either rehab or a little bit of trouble with the law, so he had just gotten back with the band. I didn't know any of this stuff. But I remember at the show going, oh my God, and I remember driving home, and I went and bought a live album from the Chuck Lamar era from the 70s that I'd been, going through at Circuit City or Best Buy or whatever. So I was like, I don't need this crap. It's not Duane. I was like, if they were that good in 1993, they had to be really good in 1973. And that was it. I was on the bus. The first time I Googled, I didn't Google. First time I did it was Prodigy. Y'all remember the Prodigy network? I found like an Allman message board. Then that canceled. When I got NetSpace on Yahoo, Allman Brothers was my first thing. I found a listserv out of Brown University that, rest in peace, it's gone. And I found like another 1,000 people who like shared this weird passion. And that drove it. But it was very early on, and realizing the bus, they were still there. I did miss out because I was 9 months old when Duane Allman died, right? I couldn't possibly be there. But I didn't miss out because they were still doing it. And so that was really it. I had seen the Dead, by the way, in 91. I saw a couple Dead shows, and those were the shows, and I was like, I remember they went off, they did that space thing that they do, which I don't like. If y'all don't know it, it goes a little wild, and, what do people say when the drugs wear off at a Dead show? This music sucks. I'm joking, Dead fans. I love the Grateful Dead. I do. But they went off stage playing a song, and then something happened, and they came back on playing another song, and I was like, oh my God, you can do that with music? Like, you can split songs up and that's what the Allman Brothers did. They just did it in a way I liked better. I like how that sound goes.
And I'm a little bit of a hypocrite today because I'm asking him to speak on being a fan and a historian. And I'm trying very much to just be an historian today, but every now and then I will add in a little aside on this. Bob and I spoke through email. My first Allman Brothers show, I was 11. It was in 1995, and I believe you saw them about 3 days before that.
Yes.
So I was also there for that. I mean, I don't even know if I'd call it a second or third wind at this point because they have so many, opportunities to bounce back. That early 90s, mid 90s period, definitely kind of them back up to the height of their
really
game.
Special.
I still carry around some ringing in my ears from that show. I'm convinced of it.
My ears are ringing right now because Alan Woody playing bass guitar.
But again, I had that same thing where I was, trying to read this as an historian, but I could also feel the fan side of me coming out with there.
I want to say I put that in there. Like, I remember as I was winding down for my last little bit, and I remember talking, same friend, and I reference him in a lot of talks, the same friend who read my dissertation and literally said, do you want a book that's going to quash a bug? Or do you want something that people are going to be interested in? Of course I wanted something. And I remember talking to him, I go, I'm just going to put some more of myself back in. I like it when authors have a little bit of that in there. And he goes, well, I like it when they don't. And I remember thinking in my head, I go, I don't give a shit what he thinks. I'm going to do it my way. And that's exactly what I ended up doing. And I appreciate that you like that. Because I spent some time over the last, and I encourage you as you do your own work, right, to your dissertation and to your book and such. I started reading books for as much how they were saying stuff than what they were saying. Like, I almost sort of removed myself from trying to consume the content in a book, and I liked the books that had a little bit of a personal tone to them. And I think part of that is because this is music, man. Music is supposed to be fun and engaging, and this is one way you can do this. But by the same token, I also know that I hoped that if you weren't interested in the Allman Brothers, for example, you would appreciate the Southern story or the cultural story that I told, or the way that I tried to put it in a context that's bigger than just 6 guys who made an album.
Absolutely. And that's, trust me, we're going to have
nice. I like that.
Try to get, I'm hoping we got
picked a good one.
So I mentioned earlier, you basically have this dual role here as a fan, as an historian, trying to write this thing. The kind of irony, I guess, in that is the Allman Brothers are a band that occupies all of these different spaces, sometimes contradictory spaces. This is a band that, likes to proclaim that it's blue collar and is getting exploratory with some of the music it's playing. They're incredibly tight with some of their arrangements. The first side of Fillmore East is, just about as tight and as locked in as a band can be, doing some blues covers. And then also here we're going to go on a 20-minute exploration. Did you find there to be any sort of challenge here with describing something that at once is, Duane's not shy about, hey, this is a song by these artists, or in interviews, these are the people we listen to, these are the people that influence us. their influences are very obvious. They'll let you know who their influences are, and also they sound like no one else. How did you try to get at actually describing what this band sounds like? Because it's so unique.
Yeah, so the two things that you said there I think are important. One is influence. They pay a lot of homage to their influences, and all the way really even now, like Warren Haynes will still do that on Warren Haynes, who played from '89 essentially to 2014 as his own band, Government Mules, constantly calling out the songs and the names, and these are the people, and that stays with the Allman Brothers throughout. I swear to God, they're the only band who introduces McKinley Morganfield repeatedly. That's Muddy Waters' real name is McKinley Morganfield, and I've heard it a lot. I think Greg thought it was somehow clever or something that he'd say it. I don't know. But influence, one thing so I deconstructed the heck out of the sound, and frankly, those of y'all who've been to grad school in the humanities and know about deconstruction, like I always heard that term, and I never quite understood what it was until I finished a book doing it. Basically deconstructed what makes up this sound. Where do the elements come from? And on this album, right, there's two really short, tight blues songs. There's an extended blues, with Stormy Monday. There's two long blues jams with You Don't Love Me, Whipping Post, and then two instrumentals. Like you're right. It's got jazz, it's got blues, it's got country blues, it's got electric blues. There's not a lot of original material on the album actually, but it's all original material because of the way that they did that. My goal, so first and foremost, like I said, Tom, I approached it first thinking that this album was inadequate in some reason because it was missing some things, and it couldn't define them because it's missing a couple of the ways that they sound. Like Blue Sky, a song like Blue Sky isn't on this record. Of course, it comes on the next one. Mountain Jam, which is my favorite song that they do, fades out at the end of Whipping Post. Dreams, which is my favorite Allman Brothers song of all time, wasn't even played that weekend. Stormy Monday, by the way, played one time. That version of Stormy Monday caught it in one freaking take. But so as I deconstructed, I had to figure out why these things aren't there, why things are missing, what this record is and represents, and that's where I had to say, what was it that Duane and the boys and the band were saying about what they wanted to accomplish in music? And that allowed me then my hook to check their excellence. How did they meet their goals? How do you find out how they met their goals? Well, that's reception, that's audience, and figuring out what the audience was saying. And we had all of the work done on the Allman Brothers prior to mine were most of them were books written by people embedded or inside with the band, either journalists or family members. So we had a whole lot of talk from the principals themselves. But no one has spent any time saying, what do people like us in 1969, 70, and 71, what were we saying about the band when we went to concerts, when we saw albums? So that's how I got past that, like, the Allman Brothers were great. No, the Allman Brothers wanted to do this. How do we know they were successful? We have several ways of knowing that. One is, what does the audience say? And the second is, what does the marketplace say, which is that next tier. So until they started selling records, they were, nothing on the scene. That's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but I had to kind of get away from what I liked about them, how they did it. Like, I would not have faded this record like they did. Every track, if you listen to the original, it fades at the end and at the beginning. It doesn't sound like a concert. If you want to hear a concert, listen to Get Your Ya-Ya's Out by the Stones. And that, for years, I thought that was a Rolling Stones concert. One of the greatest ever, by the way. And then it turns out, not only is it patched from a bunch of shows, but it's also heavily overdubbed. So I have, this album could have been presented a little bit better for my listening, but it worked.
Well, and part of it is each of their albums does sound unique. This one is maybe the weirdest of the first three in terms of, we've tried a traditional approach. We've got to go into a studio. We've got to record things a certain way. And this feels like we need a third album. What if we do it live instead of we need a live album?
I mean, yes.
And
100%.
There's some similarities to that too. And I mean, if we're looking at the timeline, Europe 72 from the Dead is following kind of in the wake of this, but also doing a similar thing where what if most of this is new material and we just present it in this way instead of going into a studio? We need a new album. We need to obviously keep up with the market and have a career out of this where we can pay our bills. But what if we did it on our own terms? And that's part of what this book is getting at is how does Duane set those terms? How does he come about that? So that's, I guess the next question here is, and you get into it and this is going to be too big of a question, but we can talk about it. What is this vision? I mean, how do you describe it? What are the kind of contours of it?
Yeah. So Duane and his bandmates. So this extends out because they all grab onto this improvisation. Warren Haynes describes it as composition in the moment. And I mean, here's the thing: you can listen to Statesboro Blues 1,000 times. They played that song God knows how many times. They used to open every show with it for years. Every version is different. Every solo is different. The singing sounds the same. The basic passages sound the same. But the way that they do things, the way the Allman Brothers do, a song is a lot like, it's a suggestion, I guess, basically. The melody is not a suggestion. The map from here to there is set. How you get from here to there is totally up to the soloist at that moment and what his bandmates are pushing, pulling, prodding, whatever there. Improvisation, creativity, live audience, absolutely vital to what he did. Duane was a very successful studio musician in Muscle Shoals, left that gig because, and I found this beautiful quote where he said, I wanted to get out playing for the people again. Muscle Shoals, when he was up there, this would have been November of 68 through about like February, March of 69. It was a real short period of time. Was the only time in his very, 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 very brief adult life that he wasn't on the road. Every other time from about the time he was 16 until he died at 24, he was on the road. So that was their natural element. You mentioned their first two records. Their first record, the Allman Brothers Band, was recorded. They'd only been together about 5 months. There's some real mature songs on it. I think Dreams is about one of the most mature songs to come out of the chute in the canon. But Whipping Post sounds a little bit, basic, if you will, or it needs more. Trouble No More comes out a couple of years later on Eat a Peach and is a completely different version. So I think that they recognized after Idlewild South didn't sell. So then the next year they recorded an album called Idlewild South. And that has Revival, People Can You Feel It, Love Is Everywhere. That opens it up. Midnight Riders on that, the studio version of Liz Reed. And I think they really did expect that to do very well. And it sounds like a great early 1970s record. And it just didn't dent the marketplace.
Yeah, it's a lot less raw than that first
it's
album. It's a little more polished, a
little
more of this is what we want to do.
And that was all timed out. They said that. We want to go in and we're going to make a record that's going to sell. And you listen to that record, it's vastly different than this one.
And I think that's part of what the book gets into. Again, I would encourage everybody here to go read the book.
Yeah, you guys listen. She came the long way. Everybody needs to buy a book, or I'll be really sad.
No, because this is sort of. I mean, again, getting back to the sort of the tragedy in this is, I'm not sure if Duane knew exactly what he wanted until this. It's a work in progress almost the whole way through.
Yeah, you know what? That was the point you made that I didn't circle. I was going in my head thinking about that. Did Alan Paul, who wrote a book called One Way Out, he's got another one coming out this summer on Brothers and Sisters. Highly recommend you pick that up if you like this story. He wrote a really good book. I helped him with it a little bit. You know, he and I talked about this years ago one time, and he's like, if there was one question I could ask Duane, it would be, did you have the sound in your head? And when it came out with the guys, you were like, yeah, that's it? Or was it, as it came, it just changed a little bit? So much of history is contingency anyway, and so if J-Mo doesn't come to Muscle Shoals, right, does Duane decide maybe just to stick around? You know, like if he hadn't met Barry Oakley the summer before in Jacksonville and really enjoyed how Barry played bass, like there's all these little ways that it happened. So I think when you look at what Duane and Greg were doing prior to joining the band, Hourglass, they were basically a cover band, a really good cover band. and they played a lot of similar songs to what ends up in the Allman Brothers repertoire, but not the same. In fact, very few of those songs made it into the Allman Brothers repertoire at all. But Tobacco Road, and they would do Buck Owens songs, and they did rhythm and blues songs and Motown songs and rock songs and stuff. They were a cover band. Barry Oakley and Dickie Betts were taking Hoochie Coochie Man by Muddy Waters and making it this just ballsy force of nature, completely changing the arrangements. Dickie says, we took them and went sideways with them. Mm-hmm. So Duane and Greg were a little more traditional. Dickie and Barry were more hippies, more psychedelic, doing that. And then you need the two drummers to kind of round out the thing. And those two, I mean, Jamo's from another planet. As far as I know, he's actually from Gulfport, Mississippi, but he's from another planet. And then Butch Trucks being the rock solid. They kind of needed each of these pieces to make what that was. But again, and the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I think that's a really important thing about the understanding the Allman Brothers Band, period. Mm-hmm. Each of them individually, even when they do their own little bands, it's not the same as when they're all together.
Absolutely. And you're getting into some of the things I'd hope we talked about, which is great, because we're going to run out of time eventually. There's too many questions. I guess one of the things I find interesting here is, and you're talking about, this debate. Did he know what he wanted it to be? Did he kind of stumble upon it and say, okay, that's getting there? It seems like there was at least some sort of idea, because everyone knew after those first jam sessions with that kind of core lineup, this is it. Even if they didn't know exactly how to formulate it. And to your point, everybody's bringing their own little kind of ingredient into this stew. I mean, Greg's got his Ray Charles influence coming in with him. Dickie's obviously got a little bit more country western, Django Reinhardt kind of thing going on. Everybody's got something they add, and I'm not sure if they'd have been able to put down on paper, oh, I need somebody that can do this and somebody that can do that. But once it's in the room together, right, that's the sound they're looking for. And even then, it takes a while to kind of, just tweak that just a tiny little bit. But this feels like it. This album feels like this is what they've been pushing for. It has this sort of, I guess, those growing pains that you can kind of hear in some of the first two albums. At Fillmore East is it. That's kind of the culmination.
It's a pretty mature record. I'll say this though, Tom. Like they were sounding like this early on. Like there's not a lot of material from '69 that circulates, but 1970 there's a fair amount, and there's a lot of what they ended up doing. They were doing. But I think the question was capturing it, on vinyl. Or, on tape and then therefore on vinyl. I think going back to your question, it really was when they got the five guys in the room with Reese Winans on keys. So just quickly for y'all's benefit, Duane leaves Muscle Shoals in late February, early March of 1969 and goes to Jacksonville with Jamo, the black drummer. So, I don't want to overestimate or underestimate this. They were living up in Muscle Shoals together. Black and a white man were living together in a cabin. I think that's very incredibly unique for the time. And then they drive across the South to Jacksonville. And eventually there's a whole jam scene going on in Jacksonville. And it's really run by Barry Oakley and Dickie Betts of the Second Coming. And they get together at the Second Coming house on March 23rd, 1969 with 5 original Allman Brothers, Duane, Dickie, Barry, Jamo, and Butch Trucks on drums, with Reese Winans on keys. And Reese Winans ended up actually playing with them at the Brothers show at Madison Square Garden. So he did the full circle, their 50th anniversary show. He filled Greg's slot. Greg came home. They called Greg within a matter of days. Duane did. Greg came home immediately, started writing songs, and within a matter of days had written Whipping Post and Black-Hearted Woman in this house in Jacksonville. And really, that first, this is it. March 23rd, 1969, and then when Greg comes 3 days later and started, and it was like, oh, okay. Greg, in fact, he has this quote. I have this quote from Dickie, but he's like, Jesus Christ, what a band! And Greg's like, I don't think I can cut this. He was so amazed by just what these 5 guys were doing. So. I suppose, and as a musician who's always searching for the sound, as a writer who's always searching for a hook as he writes or something like that, I suppose it very much is, you know it when you see it. Mm-hmm. And you've got it in your head, but until the other people can manifest it for you, Duane can't play every instrument, right? And at least at this point.
And part of, I guess part of knowing what you want or knowing what sound you're looking for comes at least a little bit from knowing what you don't want. And again, I think there's a lot to be said for this band having a survival instinct to it that comes from Duane, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think you touch on this in the book. He experiences some early failures. He experiences some early success, but knows it's not the success he wants. He knows, that Muscle Shoals gig, this isn't scratching that itch for him, even though he could continue being successful doing that. It really does take, it's both sides. It's a positive and negative influence. I know what I want, and I absolutely know what I don't want. Yeah. And I feel like certainly before he knows what he wants, Duane knows this isn't it, or this isn't scratching that itch for me. I really was kind of fascinated with, and I don't want to make too much out of it because it's a difficult question to answer, but I love that you take the time to define Southern rock. And I'm sure you knew this was coming. Part of it is, again, we touch on the Allman Brothers occupying these different roles, and we started with you occupying different roles. Duane has these dual roles at the same time. He's Southern and a musician. He's someone that's, of and from the South. He obviously has these sort of influences on him, but where do you think the Allman Brothers fits into this definition of Southern rock?
Yeah, Tom and I talked about this a little bit online, and I'll never be fully satisfied with kind of how I did this in the book, but you gave me some good words on it, which makes me feel kind of good. All right, let's back up and say prior to this album, Southern musicians in bands, Southern musicians who played rock music, had to leave the South as bands to make it. That was just a truism across the board. Nothing's going to break from the South. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is the infrastructure of the recording industry isn't down here so much, except for really Nashville. And I mean, yes, the Shoals has its thing going. There's, there are pockets of recording going on, but the industry is in Nashville, which is country music. It's in New York, which is pop music for the most part with rock tint. Somewhat Chicago and LA. Before he joins the Allman Brothers Band, he has failed in Nashville, New York, and Los Angeles. He had a band called Hourglass that he quit when he comes back to Muscle Shoals. The Shoals thing was, I think, a lot of serendipity and a little bit of a respite for him to sort of get his mind back. And he said it, like I got all, get all that jive Hollywood crap out of my head, I think is the term that he said. But, the idea being, he gets a shot from Muscle Shoals. He gets a contract with Rick Hall to do his own thing. And Rick Hall wants him to record a power trio record, like a Jimi Hendrix Experience or something. And Duane it just doesn't go well. The entire and then he sells the contract. And that's when Duane really says, all right, I'm going for broke. I'm going to do it my way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's some great quotes. It seems like the band is at least aware of, how do we fit into some of these genres.
Yes.
And the Southern rock thing, that's not the only genre we can throw them into. As we said earlier, it's kind of difficult to really pin them down and say, this is what that sounds like. But I love this quote from Greg Allman. All rock and roll came from the South. It is Southern by definition. You might as well call it rock. It really does seem like, why, and this, again, I'm not trying to put you in an unfair position.
You're not.
This might not be a question for you. It might be questions for other people. Why are the Allman Brothers Southern rock?
Yeah.
Why is Leonard Skinner Southern rock? Why is Jerry Lee Lewis not Southern rock? Why are individuals like
R.E.M.
Or the B-52 Southern
there
rock.
You go.
Little Richard Southern rock. I mean, there's all sorts of individuals who are being, performing down here, getting their careers made on, the Chitlin circuit, that are creating rock and roll. Why aren't they Southern rock?
Thank you for bringing me back to Southern rock. The definition, this is where it got a little weird to me. As Allman Brothers fan, we don't like, as a matter of course, the Allman Brothers being called Southern rock. And it's for, as best I can tell, two reasons, both of them parochial. One is the Allman Brothers are so much better than all the rest of these bands. How dare you lump them in with Leonard Skinner and blah, 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 which I think is crap, right? Like, okay. The second one is, of course, Skinner was most famous for waving around the battle flag and using it with little sense of irony whatsoever. And there was a long an idea around Allman Brothers fans that the Allman Brothers were above that. That they didn't use any Confederate imagery in this. That's wrong. They did. From 74 to 75, they did tour under the banner, and the banner stuck around in their stuff into the 90s. That's not them, but it was on their merch in the 70s. So you have that going. Let me back up, though, and say Southern rock, as we understand it, really comes around in about 1973, when the Allman Brothers have broken already, done their thing, and then they come out with Brothers and Sisters, which has Ramblin' Man, very country influenced. Skinner does their first record, comes out. Marshall Tucker Band's first record come out. And somebody somewhere says, we should call this Southern rock. And it becomes a genre or a definition. All musicians, most eschew genre. It's what Greg said is very common. They didn't like it, especially when they got back together in 89, because then they were having to answer some of this other stuff. So the way I put it in the book, Southern rock, as we understand it, is a capital S, lowercase r. Southern rock as a genre versus Southern rock being a rock band from the South, which the Allman Brothers were. Southern rock is a time and a place. I put it at about 73, ending at about MTV. So any band that comes sort of out of that, after that time period, and wasn't established as a Southern rock band. So that's why Drive-By Truckers aren't called Southern rock, for example. REM is beyond the time period. And they're playing more punk influenced music than they are rock or blues influenced music. And I think that's another, but now I'm parsing.
No, I
could keep slicing this.
I do find it sort of interesting that they're frustrated those first two albums aren't taking off. Southern rock, the brand, does kind of coincide with them taking off. It's like, well, we want success, but not like this. Not like this. We want to do it on our own terms. And there's something that you don't get too much into the book on this subject just because the nature of the book you set out to write. I'm not going to criticize the book you didn't write. This similar thing happens a number of decades on as well with the kind of jam band terminology. But in both senses, I'm not sure if Allman Brothers ever really, check off every box of these genres, which is what makes them sort of difficult to pin down. It's one of the things I enjoy about them.
That's a really, really good thing, good observation too. Jam band being the thing that's sort of come out since, and they're godfathers of that too. But most people give that to the Dead. Which even the Allman Brothers would, the Dead were very influential on the Allman Brothers, at least their au revoir and how they went about things. But Duane did not exist in the era of Southern. Duane was not alive in the era of Southern rock. But they've carried that banner. I still think, and I put it in the book, I think Skinner are the exemplars of that. Boogie blues with a country sound, a little bit of Southern attitude, or a lot of Southern attitude.
A little bit redneck.
Their necks are a little bit crimson at different times. Yep.
That's fine. I'm not trying to slander anybody.
It is very much, they're very similar. And the Allman Brothers were hugely influential on Lynyrd Skynyrd because Skynyrd's from Jacksonville, where the Allman Brothers are also where they were formed.
Well, in the interest of time, I do have a couple other things I want to discuss, but I really, really want to hit on this. You mentioned that you're trying to give a little bit of the fan perspective into this. And, sometimes other areas of history, I don't know if we have other historians in the audience, we hear about history from below. We hear about getting rid of the sort of great man history, not going with that top-down approach. It still seems like, especially in the arts and in popular culture, we'll talk about the people, Elvis, or we'll talk about these big kind of idol figures. It's one of those things you touch on. The album goes gold, I think 4 days before Duane dies.
4 days before Duane dies.
500,000 copies sold, certified 4 days before Duane dies. That's 500,000 copies out there. That's not just the 500,000 owners of that. That's their friend groups. That's the parties they're throwing. That's the people are using this to sort of soundtrack their lives, both good and bad. It's being played at parties. It's being played during people's breakups. How do you start to sort of track, the kind of trickle effect of this to the point where, you're not born during the time period. I'm born, 15 years after this time period. But I have my own sort of personal history with this album. I have my own memories of this being a part of my life. How do you track down a thing like this? How do you start to put together the piece of like, oh, this really did touch a lot of different people?
So the first was just being pretty indefatigable. being how do you say that word? I can't believe I started to say it, then I screwed
it
up. Yeah,
I mean,
I'm a dogged researcher. Let me try it that way. Once I was exposed to this idea of reception theory, like looking at how audiences receive art, really in general, then I could start to say, where are they saying those things? The good thing about researching the Allman Brothers digitally, especially many years ago, the National Endowment for Humanities funded digitization of student newspapers across the country, and that is a treasure trove for a guy like me, because college newspapers, the Allman Brothers, toured a lot. They were a very important band to the youth in that era. And when you look up Allman in the time period between about 69 to 75, really the only thing that comes up is Allman Brothers. It's great. Every once in a while I'll get, like, Penn State had somebody who's like a football player who had last name, and University of Miami just recently. So the idea for me was just digging through the sources and seeing, and once I could, conceive of, again, what is it the band is wanting to do, how is the audience hearing it, and then as I organized the work, I did it more or less chronologically, as you know, and then I could tie those quotes in, where they went. Because I have my own ideas with this album too. You're absolutely right. And and with all their stuff, did I pick certain quotes about the song Dreams because I felt they reinforced the things that I like about something? Yes, absolutely. Did I pick the best quotes? I could. How they spoke about these different things, I sure in heck did. I threw a lot of crap out on the floor. But the idea was more, what is it the band was wanting? What did the audience want? And then the proof being, the sales. The concerts were doing really well. I mean, relatively speaking, but you can reach a couple hundred people at a time at a concert, and it takes 3 hours of effort to reach those people. Or you could put out a record and reach 500,000 plus their friends and family.
Sure. I mean, and that's, not to be too cheesy with this. Let's get cheesy with it. Duane was dead long before I was born, but it's tough for me to say he hasn't been a part of my life. I can't think of a summer playlist that didn't start with Statesboro Blues. This is the soundtrack to, like, cookouts that I've had. I've got a embarrassing story about my older brother, and I promised him I would tell it. So he would come home after school in high school. And I remember him telling me one day, he said, Tom, the neighbor's dog seems to go nuts every day at about 4:30. Well, he would get home from school every day at the same time, put on Live at Fillmore East, and done somebody wrong at the beginning. When you hear the dog barks, he thought that was our neighbor. And he said, well, why is the dog barking the same time every day? You're getting home and listening to this record that has a dog bark in the auditorium. Was it a bomb scare?
No.
There's conflicting stories about that.
The dog bark is, from what I can understand, it's one of the foot pedals on the D3, and one of the valves was left open. Okay. And it makes that noise. The mark. Man, I was like, what is that? It literally says it at the beginning of Done Somebody Wrong. Yeah.
And we had to explain to him, no,
that's awesome.
This is not our neighbor's dog losing their mind. But that's a story from, 30 years down the road of some kid in South Carolina having his own sort of personal response to this thing. It's part of, and the book touches on a little bit. I can't remember the exact quote and who it was from. That Duane does have this post life. He has this afterlife. He's part of this world. He creates this document with his brothers here that really does speak to his kind of identity, speaks to his ideas, and it's still here, and it's still vital, and it's still something that people, interact with. And
it's pretty timeless. And I can't tell you how many times I've listened to this record. I was one of the top, 0.0001% of Allman Brothers listeners the last couple of years, because I just had it on Spotify, and I just played it, because that's just how I roll. I listen to music constantly anyway as I write. You might know I could tell I have a little bit of ADHD, and so that keeps my brain a little bit more occupied. But yeah, every note on this record I could sing to you, with a little bit of prompting, entire movements that I look forward to. I will meditate to parts of this record, literally just close my eyes and just listen to the music and let it take me. It is an absolute timeless document. And what I will tell you, Tom, is if you listen to them throughout the 70 and 71 when we have the most stuff, it's like an uncommonly good recording, but it's uncommonly good because they're always good. And I don't say, I mean, I've done a decent amount of listening of everything they've done through this period, and you really don't hear a lot. There are some times, but for the most part, you got to be listening hard to catch anything going on. Mm-hmm. It's a timeless record. It is, and it wasn't supposed to be double. I'm convinced. You were talking earlier about putting the songs on. The Dead did Live Dead in '69. Mm-hmm. Had two songs that they had previously released. One of them, Dark Star. So to me, that's the equivalent of putting Whipping Post on this, right? They put Dark Star, or even Liz Reed. Those are the two songs that had been released before, and their versions on Fillmore East are the absolute perfect versions of those songs compared to anything else, that they have done.
It makes it difficult to go back to those studio versions. I mean, there's something just a little bit lacking. And it might even be just in my head that I'm filling in what I expect to be hearing.
Yes,
and I mentioned it earlier, and maybe this is a good way to close out. Duane experiences a number of setbacks early on, and even his success. It's not the success on his terms. It's not exactly what he wants. Even mentioning Muscle Shoals, could have gone down that road. Could have tried to embrace maybe where the industry wanted him to go. He had to overcome those things to put this band together. That sort of allows the band. I feel like this band has always had this kind of survival instinct, this tenacity, this stubbornness, for lack of a better word. This band survives for a long, long time after Duane, survives for a long time post Barry Oakley. It manages to survive the deaths of Lamar. It survives the death of Alan Woody wasn't there at the time, but part of that extended world.
Dickie's departure.
It survived Dickie's departure. How do what do you think kept this band? What kept this band going? How was that kind of, even before Duane's death? I feel like the root of this was planted there. Of this band can survive and continues doing it in a way where I can't think of a whole lot of bands that continue to really hit this height of, especially live performance, decades down the road.
Yeah, and really throughout their life, even like 80, 81, 82, where they were, I call it nadir of the 81, 82, they were still playing, really, really great live concerts. I think it was all set in those early days. Duane's idea, the band agreed. They had all already determined we're going to go broke playing original music. Almost all of them had accepted that. J-Mo had said, I'm going to go to New York and be a jazz drummer. I'm starving now. I might as well starve doing something I love. So I think what gets down to it is, when you're that young and you lose somebody like Duane, Duane was their leader. He was their founder. He was their guide star. His brother Greg was nowhere near as he was a much more laconic personality, really throughout his whole life, and so they lost that leader. And I think for them, as young as they were, they only had one choice, which is we got to go back on the road. Now, this is a piece I missed in the book, saying it this way, because it saved the band. And it cost Barry Oakley his life. So Barry Oakley dies at the end of a 90-show tour as a quintet. So they toured without Duane. They toured with just 5. And at the end of that, Barry Oakley also dies in a motorcycle accident in Macon, Georgia, 0.2 of a mile from where Duane was killed in a motorcycle accident. So it cost them. And the quote that Dickie had in a documentary about it, he said, by that time we were just so damn tough. And you said that. So each time, as they had, the success of this record allows them to make the artistic and personal choices that they end up making the rest of their lives. And each time they get back together, 79 and 89, they say, we're going to do it different. We're going to go more toward how Duane was, this whole thing. And then success gets in their eyes, and then they broke up. In 89, they somehow found a way to hold it together for those last 25 years. But I think it's, it's definitely commitment that they made to each other and to Duane. I think there's a brotherhood element to these guys, to this band. I think some musicians just understand we're better together than apart. And so that's another reason why they do. The music is good, and the audience, you are a second or third generation, of audience members, and Like my kids are, well, they don't love the Allman Brothers, but they'll put up with it. They can't help it. So it's, I think that is, to me, that the 43-year career without him is probably the most remarkable thing of this whole thing, because had Jerry Garcia died in 69 or 70, because Garcia dies in 95, that's the end of the Grateful Dead. They don't even really attempt anything for a number of years. That's like 30 years after they got started, right? So Garcia is probably one of the, I can't think of any others right off the top of my head, of people who were like Duane, who were a part of a whole, but an important part. Jimmy's different because he died. Jim Morrison's different because he was the lead singer. Janis Joplin's different because she's Janis Joplin. But Duane was one of six, and a really important one of six, but no more important than the rest of the guys in the band, as they show.
Well, it seems to me, and I'm not trying to get too far out on a limb here, this idea that Duane has allows these other bandmates, and I kind of caution against that, because survival is maybe not the right word. You're right, Barry Oakley doesn't survive this. He never really gets over that death. But some of the other members are able to sort of overcome this with that vision.
Certainly were.
He's put it in there. But not only that, this document, this album, this piece of cultural history also preps some of these guys decades down the road. It's easy for Derek to kind of join in the band. He's been listening to this since he was 6 years old. Warren Haynes, I'm sure, was listening to this in high school and practicing with it. It's such a unique and living document that even people that weren't there, if they go engage with this, it almost gets them into the fold in a way that I can't imagine a number of other bands being able to bring in people like this. I mean, they part ways with Dickie Betts. You were mentioning the kind of Grateful Dead comparison. If Dead and Company, fired Bob Weir, it's kind of hard for me to imagine them continuing on.
The end of it.
But they have another, 14 years of some of the best work they've ever produced. It's just kind of, I think, a testament to what Duane instilled in this band to kind of take any sort of any punch that's out there in the universe, they can survive it.
Yeah.